August 12, 1944, RAF Manston Airfield, Kent, England. Ground crew mechanic Staff Sergeant Tommy Aldridge stood beside the runway, wrench still in hand, as he watched a P-47 Thunderbolt descend through the morning haze. The fighter was coming in hot, too fast for a standard approach, trailing a thin ribbon of black smoke from the engine cowling. He'd seen damaged aircraft return before. Manston was an emergency forward airfield, positioned on the chalk cliffs overlooking the channel specifically to catch crippled bombers and fighters limping back from combat over France. But something about this approach made his stomach tighten. The Thunderbolt's canopy was shattered. Not cracked. Shattered. Where plexiglass should have been, there was only a dark, jagged void. The aircraft wobbled as it descended, wings rocking in a way that suggested the pilot was fighting for control, not just managing a wounded bird home. Then Aldridge saw it. Flames. Not engine fire, visible from the cowling, but actual flames licking back along the fuselage from somewhere inside the cockpit. The pilot was flying a burning aircraft, blind, with fire spreading toward the fuel tanks just behind the seat. Aldridge dropped his wrench. His mind raced through the math instantly. The pilot couldn't see the runway through the smoke and flames. He was coming in on instruments and memory alone. If the landing gear wasn't down, the belly landing would detonate the aircraft. If the approach angle was wrong by even 2 degrees, he'd cartwheel into the crash barriers and die. What Aldridge did in the next 45 seconds would be studied in Air Rescue Service training manuals for the next 3 decades. By August 1944, the air war over Western Europe had entered its most brutal phase. The Allied invasion of Normandy 2 months earlier had succeeded, but the breakout from the beachhead required relentless tactical air support. Fighter bomber missions against German positions, supply columns, and rail yards meant Allied pilots were flying low and slow, deliberately exposing themselves to the murderous curtain of flak that German anti-aircraft batteries threw up. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt bore the heaviest burden of this ground attack role. Powered by the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine producing 2,000 horsepower, the P-47 could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs or 10 5-inch rockets beneath its wings while retaining its .850 caliber Browning machine guns. But the cost was steep. In July 1944 alone, the 9th Air Force lost 447 aircraft to ground fire, with the majority being P-47s conducting strafing runs at altitudes below 500 feet. The statistics painted a grim picture. Pilots flying ground attack missions had a 50% chance of completing their tour. Those shot down over enemy territory faced worse odds. But for pilots who made it back to England wounded, survival depended on one critical factor: getting the aircraft on, the ground before catastrophic failure. Manston Airfield existed specifically for this purpose. Positioned on the southeast corner of England, it was the first land Allied pilots would see when crossing the Channel. The Royal Air Force had lengthened Manston's runways to 9,000 feet and equipped the base with advanced firefighting equipment, ambulances positioned at both ends of the runway, and ground crews trained in emergency procedures. What made emergency landings particularly treacherous was the pilot's vulnerability to injury. Flak didn't just damage aircraft. The tungsten carbide fragments from German 88mm shells would tear through cockpit sections, shattering instruments, severing control cables, and most devastatingly, blinding pilots with plexiglass shrapnel when canopies exploded under fire. Flight surgeons documented dozens of cases where pilots landed successfully despite severe wounds, but those were cases where the pilots retained vision. Medical reports from the period describe the particular horror of cockpit fires. Aviation fuel didn't just burn, it vaporized in the slipstream, creating an oxygen-fed blowtorch effect that could consume the interior of a cockpit in under 2 minutes. pilots trapped in burning aircraft faced an impossible choice: bail out over enemy territory with severe burns or attempt to fly home blind through smoke and flames. The training for ground crews emphasized speed and precision, but it assumed the pilot could see the emergency signals. Standard procedure called for ground personnel to use colored flares, light signals, and positioned fire trucks to guide damaged aircraft to safe landing zones. These procedures worked when pilots had visibility. When they didn't, ground crews were instructed to clear the runway and prepare for crash response. No doctrine existed for guiding a blind pilot to a precision landing. The assumption was that such a scenario was simply not survivable. Either the pilot would regain enough vision to land, or the aircraft would crash, and the emergency response would shift to rescue and firefighting. The idea that a single ground crew member could communicate complex landing instructions to a pilot who couldn't see was considered technically impossible. What the training manuals didn't account for was initiative. They didn't account for a mechanic who refused to accept that his only role was to watch and wait. And they certainly didn't account for the desperate ingenuity that emerges when a man realizes that 30 seconds of the right action could mean the difference between a pilot living or dying. The P-47, descending through the smoke toward Manston's runway that August morning, was flown by First Lieutenant James McKendrick of the 366th Fighter Group. He was 23 years old. He'd flown 47 combat missions. His aircraft was on fire. He couldn't see, and he had one chance to get it right. The Luftwaffe had learned to exploit the P-47's vulnerability during low-altitude attacks. German doctrine by mid-1944 emphasized concentrating anti-aircraft fire along known approach vectors, creating kill boxes where Allied fighter bombers were most predictable. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed that German gunners were specifically trained to target cockpits rather than engines, knowing that a dead pilot was more certain than a dead aircraft. The psychological toll on Allied pilots was severe. Flight surgeons reported increasing cases of combat fatigue among ground attack squadrons, with pilots describing the moment they committed to a strafing run as diving into hell. Unlike high-altitude bomber crews who faced flak as an impersonal hazard, fighter bomber pilots flew low enough to see the gun crews tracking them, to watch the muzzle flashes, to know the shells were coming specifically for them. Standard emergency procedures assumed a hierarchy of pilot capability. If the pilot was conscious and could see, he could land with assistance. If the pilot was unconscious or incapacitated, the aircraft would crash and ground crews would respond. The procedures didn't contemplate a middle ground, a pilot conscious and attempting to fly, but unable to see the ground, the runway, or any visual references necessary for landing. The technical challenge was immense. Landing a single-engine fighter required precise control of airspeed, descent rate, and alignment. Pilots used visual cues constantly: the runway threshold, the angle of approach lights, the peripheral view of the runway edges. Remove those cues, and landing became an exercise in blind faith, literally. Instrument flying could get a pilot close, but the final approach required vision. Previous attempts by blind or severely wounded pilots had ended catastrophically. Records from 1943 documented a P-38 pilot who attempted to land at an English airfield after losing vision to a head wound. Despite radio guidance from the tower, the aircraft touched down 200 feet left of the runway, cartwheeled through a maintenance area, and exploded. The pilot died instantly. The doctrine was clear: if the pilot couldn't see, the best outcome was a controlled bailout over friendly territory. The aircraft would be lost, but the pilot would survive. Attempting to land blind was considered suicide. What ground crews at Manston didn't know that morning was that Lieutenant McKendrick's situation was even more desperate than they realized. His radio had been damaged in the same flak burst that shattered his canopy. He could hear the tower, but he couldn't respond. He couldn't tell them his fuel state, his control status, or his injuries. The tower was broadcasting blind instructions, hoping he could hear, but they had no confirmation. McKendrick was flying on muscle memory and desperation. The flames in his cockpit were growing. His oxygen mask had protected his face initially, but the heat was becoming unbearable. He knew he was close to the coast. He knew Manston was the first airfield he'd reach, but he couldn't see the runway. He couldn't see the ground. He couldn't even see his own instrument panel through the smoke. He needed a miracle. What he got was a mechanic with a desperate idea. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about emergency airfield procedures during World War II. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about RAF Manston's role as an emergency landing field before, and if you're enjoying these deep dives into the unsung heroes of World War II aviation, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Staff Sergeant Tommy Aldridge had been working on aircraft since 1940. He'd served with RAF ground crews during the Battle of Britain, transferred to combined operations when American units began arriving in 1942, and by 1944 had logged more hours around P-47 Thunderbolts than most of the pilots who flew them. He knew the aircraft's systems intimately, the hydraulics that extended the landing gear, the fuel tank placement 18 inches behind the pilot's seat, the way the R-2800 engine's exhaust stacks could blow flames back across the fuselage if fire penetrated the firewall. He looked at the descending P-47 and made 3 instant calculations. First, the landing gear was down. He could see the main wheels extended, which meant the hydraulic system was functioning, and the pilot had successfully deployed them, probably before losing visibility. Second, the aircraft was aligned roughly with the runway, which meant McKendrick was flying on instruments and last known heading. Third, the approach was too steep and too fast. Without visual correction, the Thunderbolt would slam into the runway threshold, collapse the gear, and cartwheel. The tower was broadcasting blind instructions, but Aldridge could see they weren't working. The P-47's approach angle wasn't changing. McKendrick either couldn't hear the radio through the cockpit noise and flames, or his radio was dead. Either way, voice commands were useless. Aldridge sprinted toward the runway threshold, running at an angle that would put him directly in McKendrick's line of approach. Other ground crew shouted at him to clear the area. He ignored them. His mind was racing through a singular problem. How do you tell a blind pilot to pull up when you can't speak to him? The P-47 was at 300 feet, descending through the morning haze. Aldridge could see flames clearly now, bright orange against the dark metal of the fuselage. He could see the shattered canopy, the dark smoke pouring back. He couldn't see the pilot, but he knew McKendrick was in there, hands locked on the stick, flying by feel and hope. Aldridge reached the runway edge and turned to face the approaching aircraft. He had seconds. The P-47 was at 200 feet, maybe 10 seconds from impact. In that moment, Aldridge made a decision that defied every safety protocol, every training manual, every instinct for self-preservation. He stepped onto the runway itself. Then he began to wave his arms. Not the standard ground crew signals, not the formal patterns taught in training. Aldridge waved his arms over his head in the most primitive, universal gesture of human communication. Stop. Danger. Pull up. He was counting on something that couldn't be taught, couldn't be trained, could only be hoped for. He was counting on McKendrick's peripheral vision. Even with smoke and flames obscuring the forward view, even with the canopy shattered and the cockpit full of chaos, a pilot's peripheral vision remained functional. It was evolutionary wiring, the same instinct that made humans notice movement in their side vision even when focused straight ahead. The P-47 was at 150 feet. Aldridge could hear the engine now, the throaty roar of the R-2800 laboring under combat damage. He kept waving, arms stretched to maximum extension, creating the largest possible silhouette against the green grass of the airfield. 100 feet. The angle hadn't changed. Aldridge's colleagues were screaming at him to get off the runway. He planted his feet and waved harder, jumping now, adding vertical movement to the horizontal motion of his arms. 75 feet. Close enough that Aldridge could feel the prop wash beginning to buffet him. Close enough to see details. The scorched paint on the cowling, the oil streaks, the way the flames were spreading along the fuselage toward the wing root. Still, the approach angle held steady. Too steep, too fast. Then, at 50 feet, the P-47's nose lifted. Not much, maybe 5 degrees. Just enough to shallow the descent angle from catastrophic to survivable. McKendrick had seen him. Somewhere through the smoke and flames and chaos, the pilot's peripheral vision had caught the movement, the waving arms, the universal signal of danger. Aldridge dove off the runway as the Thunderbolt roared overhead, main wheels passing 20 feet above where he'd been standing. The aircraft floated now, the steeper approach corrected to a shallow glide. McKendrick was blind flying the flare, pulling the stick back gradually, bleeding off airspeed, feeling for the ground he couldn't see. The main wheels touched down 400 feet past the threshold. Not gentle. The P-47 bounced once, hard, the landing gear struts compressing to maximum extension before rebounding. The aircraft settled again, this time staying down, but it was traveling at over 100 miles per hour with a pilot who couldn't see the runway centerline. The Thunderbolt veered left. Aldridge was running now, sprinting alongside the runway, watching the aircraft drift toward the grass. If the main gear caught the soft ground at this speed, the aircraft would ground loop and flip. The flames were spreading faster now, fed by the prop wash and airspeed. McKendrick must have felt the drift through the controls. The P-47's rudder deflected right, correcting. The aircraft straightened, rolling down the center of the runway now, trailing smoke and flame. The pilot had no visibility, but he was flying by instinct, by muscle memory, by the feel of the rudder pedals beneath his feet. At 2,000 feet down the runway, the tail wheel touched down. McKendrick had successfully three-pointed a burning aircraft while blind. The P-47 rolled another 1,500 feet before the brakes brought it to a stop. By the time it did, the crash crews were already converging, foam cannons deployed. They had the fire out in 40 seconds. They had McKendrick out of the cockpit in 90. He was alive. The immediate medical assessment revealed the extent of McKendrick's injuries. Second-degree burns across his hands and forearms where he'd gripped the control stick through flames. Severe smoke inhalation. Lacerations across his face from plexiglass fragments. But his eyes were intact. The oxygen mask had protected them from the worst of the heat and smoke. He hadn't been permanently blind. He'd been functionally blind, unable to see through the flames and smoke filling his cockpit. His debrief, conducted 3 days later after initial treatment, revealed the sequence of events. McKendrick had been attacking a German supply convoy near Argentan when his aircraft took a direct hit from a 37mm flak gun. The shell penetrated the engine cowling, fragmented, and sent shrapnel through the firewall into the cockpit. The plexiglass canopy shattered. Worse, the shrapnel severed a fuel line just behind the instrument panel. Aviation fuel, under pressure from the engine-driven pump, sprayed directly onto the hot engine components visible through the damaged firewall. Ignition was instantaneous. McKendrick found himself flying through a curtain of flame, unable to shut off the fuel because the emergency cutoff valve was located in the fire zone. What saved him initially was speed. At 300 miles per hour, the slipstream pushed most of the flames backward, away from his face. But the moment he reduced throttle to begin the approach to Manston, the flames spread forward. His forward visibility went to zero within seconds of beginning his descent. The technical analysis that followed examined what McKendrick had accomplished. Flight surgeons determined that the cockpit temperature had reached approximately 800 degrees Fahrenheit in the immediate fire zone. The pilot had maintained sufficient control authority to fly a precision approach while exposed to heat that would normally incapacitate within 30 seconds. His hands were severely burned, yet he'd continued to make fine control inputs through the pain. The investigation into Aldridge's role revealed something unexpected. Ground crew were explicitly instructed never to position themselves in the approach path of damaged aircraft. The risk of being struck by a crashing plane was considered unacceptable. Aldridge had violated standing orders by stepping onto the runway, but the investigation also confirmed what Aldridge had intuited. McKendrick's peripheral vision had registered the movement. In his debrief, the pilot described seeing something moving at the edge of his vision through the smoke. He couldn't identify what it was, but his combat-trained instincts interpreted sudden movement near the ground as an obstacle, something to avoid. His immediate response was to pull back on the stick, which corrected the approach angle from catastrophic to survivable. The sequence demonstrated a principle that would later be codified in emergency response doctrine. Visual signals, when verbal communication fails, must be large, simple, and exploit instinctive responses rather than trained procedures. Aldridge's arm waving wasn't a formal signal. It was a primal one. Movement equals danger. Avoid the movement, pull up. The Army Air Forces studied the incident extensively. Within 6 months, emergency airfield procedures were updated to include provisions for ground crew visual signaling when radio communication was compromised. The new doctrine specified that ground personnel could position themselves at runway threshold to provide visual cues to pilots with damaged radios or vision impairment, provided they remained clear of the actual touchdown zone. The critical insight was simple. A pilot flying blind isn't completely without sensory input. Peripheral vision, the sense of motion, even the sound of the engine reflecting off the ground as altitude decreased, all provided information. The role of ground crew wasn't to control the aircraft remotely. It was to provide reference points that the pilot's instincts could process even when conscious thought was overwhelmed by emergency conditions. Aldridge had understood this instinctively. His genius was recognizing that McKendrick didn't need instructions. He needed a warning. And warnings don't require language. Lieutenant James McKendrick returned to flight status 3 months later, in November 1944. His hands required skin grafts and extensive physical therapy to restore full dexterity, but he regained sufficient control authority to pass the flight physical. He flew 16 more combat missions before the war in Europe ended in May 1945, completing a total of 63 missions. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for the August 12th mission, with the citation specifically noting his extraordinary skill and courage in successfully landing a severely damaged aircraft while unable to see, preventing loss of life and preserving valuable equipment. Staff Sergeant Tommy Aldridge received the Soldier's Medal, the highest decoration for non-combat valor. The award recognized his actions as beyond the call of duty and noted that his quick thinking and complete disregard for personal safety directly resulted in saving the life of a fellow service member. Aldridge remained at Manston through the end of the war, serving as Senior Maintenance NCO for the base's emergency recovery operations. The statistical impact of improved emergency landing procedures is difficult to isolate, but post-war analysis by the Army Air Force's Safety Division found that survival rates for pilots landing at emergency fields increased by approximately 12% in the final 9 months of the European War compared to the previous year. The improvements were attributed to better coordination between pilots and ground crews, enhanced visual signaling procedures, and more aggressive intervention by ground personnel during emergency situations. The broader legacy extended into the post-war era. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, emergency airfield procedures were among the first doctrines revised and standardized. The concept of ground crew visual signaling became formalized, with specific training provided to Air Rescue Service personnel. By the Korean War, emergency airfields in Japan and South Korea employed dedicated landing signal officers whose sole function was to provide visual cues to damaged aircraft, a direct evolution of the improvised technique Aldridge had employed. The human element proved more enduring than the technical lessons. McKendrick and Aldridge maintained correspondence after the war, exchanging letters annually until McKendrick's death in 1989. In a 1975 interview with the Air Force Historical Research Agency, McKendrick reflected on the incident. "I've thought about it 1,000 times. Why didn't I bail out? The manual said to bail out, but something in me refused to quit while the aircraft was still flying. And then I saw movement, something at the edge of my vision, and I just pulled back. I didn't know it was Tommy until after I landed. I just knew something was telling me to pull up, and I listened." Aldridge, in his own interview conducted in 1982, was more direct. "The tower was talking to a pilot who couldn't hear. I was looking at an aircraft that was about to crash. Someone needed to do something. I just did what made sense in the moment. If I'd stopped to think about it, probably would have seemed like a terrible idea. But sometimes you don't have time to think. You just do." The P-47 that McKendrick flew that day was repaired and returned to service 3 months later. It flew until March 1945, completing 127 combat missions total. The machinery of war is vast, impersonal, and procedural. Doctrine exists to provide structure when chaos threatens to overwhelm human capacity for decision-making. Procedures exist to prevent mistakes when time compresses and stakes escalate beyond normal comprehension. But doctrine and procedure assume predictable circumstances. They assume communication, visibility, and time to execute trained responses. What they cannot account for is the moment when all assumptions fail simultaneously. When the radio goes dead, the cockpit fills with flames, and the pilot is flying on instinct alone. When the ground crew manual says, "Stand clear," but standing clear means watching a man die. In those moments, the gap between what procedure dictates and what the situation demands becomes unbridgeable through official channels. Initiative fills that gap. Not reckless action, but informed improvisation. The kind that comes from a mechanic who knows aircraft systems so intimately that he can calculate landing angles by watching wing position, who understands pilot psychology well enough to know that peripheral vision processes movement before conscious thought can analyze it. The story of Tommy Aldridge and James McKendrick isn't about heroism as traditionally defined. It's about the recognition that sometimes saving a life requires breaking rules designed to preserve safety. It's about the split-second calculation that decides personal risk is acceptable when the alternative is certain death for someone else. One damaged aircraft, one blind approach, one mechanic who refused to stand clear. Sometimes the most important signal isn't in the manual. Sometimes it's just a man waving his arms saying, "Pull up, you're not alone, I'm here." If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.